All right, welcome back to the deep dive. As philosophers, there are certain questions we just can't seem to shake.
Oh, absolutely. Some just stick with you.
Yeah, and today we're diving into one that's right at the heart of aesthetics, one that I'm sure you've already pondered quite a bit. What is art?
A classic. And a deceptively simple sounding question.
Right. It seems straightforward at first, but as we'll see, it's a real philosophical rabbit hole.
It really is. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy even calls it out as, well, controversial, is putting it mildly. There's a lot of debate about how to even approach it.
And that's exactly what we're here to unpack.
Mhm.
So for this deep dive, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia's entry on defining art as our main source. We really want to get to the bottom of this. What are the main attempts to define art? What problems do they run into? And why, after centuries of debate, do we still not have a universally accepted definition?
Yeah, it's a puzzle for sure.
Yeah.
And the encyclopedia actually outlines three main categories of definitions that we'll be looking at today.
Okay, so let's hear them.
So first we have conventionalist definitions.
Okay.
And those break down into institutional and historical perspectives. Then we have traditional definitions,
Right.
primarily focused on aesthetic properties. And finally, there are hybrid definitions that try to, blend those approaches.
Interesting. So we've got a good roadmap. But before we jump into specific definitions, we need to address the elephant in the room, right? The very challenge of defining art in the first place.
Absolutely. It's like trying to define, I don't know, love or happiness. It's so slippery. Can we really capture something as dynamic and multifaceted as art with a neat little verbal formula?
It's a good question. And the Stanford Encyclopedia actually highlights several key controversies right off the bat.
Oh, I bet. Like what?
Well, first, can art even be defined in a philosophically meaningful way? Is it even possible? And if so, what should our definitions prioritize? Should we be focusing on the institutions surrounding art or the aesthetic qualities of art itself? Or is it some kind of a mix?
Right. Where do you even begin? And then you've got the incredible diversity of art. The encyclopedia actually lays out this fascinating list of characteristics that any definition has to grapple with.
Oh, I like lists. Let's hear it.
Okay, so first off, we're talking about objects and performances going back literally hundreds of thousands of years in practically every culture imaginable.
That's a long history.
Yeah, it really is. And these objects and performances, they're created with at least some degree of aesthetic intent, even if they also serve other function.
Oh, right. Like religious rituals or political propaganda.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of non-human art. Could animals or even AI create something we'd consider art? And we can't forget the value judgment we place on art. Why do we care about it so much? What makes it special? And of course, there's the ever-present fact that art is constantly evolving, pushing boundaries, and defying categorization.
Yeah, just when you think you've got it pinned down, something new comes along and throws your whole definition out the window.
It's true. And on top of all that, the encyclopedia reminds us that aesthetic qualities aren't unique to art. We find beauty in nature, in mathematics, in everyday life.
So it's not just about figuring out what sets art apart, but about understanding how those aesthetic qualities function differently in art compared to, say, a beautiful sunset.
Yeah, there are a lot of layers here. And to add to the challenge, the encyclopedia mentions two constraints we need to keep in mind when trying to define art.
Okay, what are they?
First, we should avoid list-like definitions. Just rattling off a bunch of examples without any underlying principle. It doesn't really get to the heart of what makes something art.
Right, it's like defining a car by just listing every make and model.
Exactly. And second, our definitions need to account for vagueness. Art, like many concepts, has fuzzy boundaries. There are going to be borderline cases where it's not clear-cut whether something is or isn't art. A good definition should acknowledge that gray area.
So it's not just about what art is, but also about how we go about defining it. There are certain rules of the game. And with all these challenges in mind, it's no wonder that philosophers have struggled with this question for centuries.
Yeah, and the encyclopedia takes us on a little historical tour of some of those attempts, starting with Plato.
Okay, let's hear about Plato's take.
Well, for Plato, art was essentially mimesis or imitation, but he wasn't exactly praising it.
Oh, why not?
Well, in his view, the real world was already just a copy of these perfect, unchanging forms.
Okay, I remember that from my undergrad days.
Right. So art was a copy of a copy, twice removed from true reality. Ontologically inferior, he called it, like the shadows of shadows. He thought it led us further away from true knowledge.
So art is playing a dangerous game of telephone with reality.
Pretty much. And it wasn't just a matter of accuracy. Plato was also worried about the psychological effects of art. He felt it appealed to our less rational, more emotional side. He thought it distracted us from truth and morality, which he considered far more important than beauty.
Oh, wow. So not exactly a fan of art then.
Not in the way we typically understand it. For Plato, beauty was this metaphysical concept tied to the form of beauty, something grasped through reason, not the senses.
Okay, so a pretty critical view. Now, if we fast forward a bit, we come to Kant.
Yeah.
And he seems to have a very different perspective, particularly on what he called fine art.
Yeah, Kant was interested in what made art unique, and he landed on this idea of it being purposive without a purpose, meaning fine art wasn't just about achieving some external goal, like representing the world accurately or conveying a moral message. It had its own internal purpose, which was to stimulate our mental powers and facilitate communication.
So it's about the experience itself, the way it engages our minds.
Exactly. And Kant also emphasized the role of genius in art creation. He believed artists had this innate talent, almost like nature itself was speaking through them. He really shifted the focus to the subjective experience and the creative process rather than just the object itself.
Okay, so a much more positive view of art than Plato's.
Oh, for sure. But it's important to remember that for Kant, art was just one piece of his larger philosophical system. He was trying to figure out how our minds make sense of the world, and art was part of that puzzle.
Right, it fits into his whole framework of knowledge and experience. Now, what about Hegel? How did he see art?
Hegel, well, he was all about connecting art to truth, specifically absolute truth. He saw beauty as the sensory expression of this deeper truth. And for him, the universe was the unfolding of this truth, this rational order. He believed art, alongside religion and philosophy, helped us grasp this underlying order, this interconnectedness of everything.
So art is like a window into the fundamental nature of reality.
In a way, yes, but Hegel also saw art as limited because it relied on the senses. He thought philosophy, which worked with pure concepts, was a more advanced way of understanding truth. He even proposed this historical evolution, where art was the dominant mode of expression in early civilizations, followed by religion, and eventually culminating in philosophy.
Interesting. So art is like a stepping stone to higher forms of knowledge.
That's how he saw it. But as we move into the 20th century, the encyclopedia points out a major shift in thinking about art.
Oh, what happened?
Well, skepticism started to take hold. Philosophers began to question whether defining art was even possible or useful.
A real crisis of definition. What led to this skepticism?
Several factors. One was the influence of Wittgenstein, particularly his ideas about language and concepts. He argued that some concepts, like game, don't have clear-cut boundaries or a single essence. Instead, they're held together by these overlapping similarities, like a family resemblance.
Right, like there's no one feature that all games share, but you can still recognize a game when you see one.
Exactly. And applying this to art, a philosopher named Weitz argued that art is also an open concept, always capable of expanding to include new and unforeseen forms. So any attempt to create a fixed definition would inevitably fail to capture its dynamic nature.
So art is essentially undefinable because it's always changing and evolving.
That's the argument. But as the encyclopedia notes, not everyone agreed. Some argued that concepts can evolve without losing their core identity, and that our decisions about extending a concept can be principled, not arbitrary.
Right, like we didn't stop calling smartphones phones just because they're vastly different from the rotary phones of the past.
Precisely. So the debate about the open concept argument continues, but there were other reasons for skepticism too. Some argued that the very language we use to talk about art, words like expressive or formal, are themselves based on shaky philosophical foundations.
So it's like building a house on sand. The definition is only as good as the concepts it relies on.
Right. And then there's the historical argument. A scholar named Christeller pointed out that the modern system of the 5 major arts is actually a fairly recent invention.
Really? Never thought about that.
Yeah, it solidified in the 18th century. So if the very category of art is a historical construct, then maybe there's no stable thing for us to define across different eras.
It's like trying to define democracy in ancient Greece. The concept itself had a different meaning.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, some philosophers drew on cognitive science, specifically the idea of prototype theory.
What's that about?
Well, it suggests that we categorize things based on their resemblance to typical examples, rather than by applying strict rules.
So we recognize a chair as a chair because it looks like other chairs we've seen before. not because it meets some abstract definition of chairness.
Exactly. And if that's how our minds work, then maybe the search for a definition of art based on necessary and sufficient conditions is misguided.
So instead of defining art, maybe we should be looking at how we actually categorize things as art in our daily lives.
That's one way to approach it. And finally, there's the argument that different art concepts serve different purposes.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we might use the term art when talking about history, aesthetics, communication, or even just personal taste. So the argument goes, no single definition can adequately capture all these different ways we use the concept.
So it's like using the same word for different tools in a toolbox. Each tool has its own specific function.
Right. But even with all this skepticism, some philosophers tried to find ways to describe art without resorting to strict definitions. And one approach was the family resemblance view.
That sounds familiar, like Wittgenstein's idea of games.
Exactly. It suggests that something is art if it shares enough similarities with paradigm artworks. Like, there's no single feature that all artworks share, but they have this web of overlapping characteristics.
Okay, I can see how that might work. But doesn't it just push the problem back a step? How do we choose those paradigm artworks in the first place?
Good point. And then there's the cluster account, which offers a list of properties commonly associated with art.
Like aesthetic qualities, expressiveness, originality, and so on.
Yeah, things like that. And the idea is that no single property is necessary for something to be art, but if it has enough of these properties, it qualifies.
But isn't that just a fancy way of creating a really long definition?
It kind of is, and there are questions about whether the list is exhaustive and whether certain properties are more important than others. It's a messy business for sure.
It sounds like it. Now, the encyclopedia then moves on to contemporary approaches, and it highlights this tension between art's historical and cultural aspects and its more universal aesthetic core.
Yeah, it's a tough balance to strike, and it even raises the question of whether our Western concept of art can be applied to other cultures without being, well, kind of imperialistic.
Right, it's important to be mindful of that. So, with all that in mind, let's look at some of these contemporary definitions. The encyclopedia divides them into two main groups, conventionalist and traditional, or functional.
Okay, let's start with conventionalist definitions. These tend to downplay the role of aesthetics and focus more on the social and historical contexts that determine what we consider art.
So it's not about beauty or form, but about the institutions and traditions that shape our understanding of art.
Exactly. And this approach was heavily influenced by the rise of avant-garde art in the 20th century, with all those movements that seemed to reject traditional notions of what art should be.
Like Duchamp's famous urinal, or Cage's silent piece.
Yeah, those really shook things up. And one of the most influential conventionalist theories is Arthur Danto's idea of the art world.
Okay, tell me about the art world.
Well, Danto argued that for something to be art, it has to exist within a certain context, a network of theories, practices, and institutions that he called the art world. It's not enough for something to be aesthetically pleasing or well-crafted. It has to be understood in relation to art history and the ongoing dialogue about art.
So it's about belonging to a certain community and participating in a shared conversation about art.
Exactly. But this view has been criticized for being a bit circular. Like, how do we define the art world without already having a concept of art? And it doesn't seem to work well for non-narrative art forms like music, where the historical context might be less important.
Right, a good point. What about George Dickey? He also had an institutional theory, right?
Yeah, Dickey's theory is more elaborate. He defines art as an artifact that has been given the status of candidate for appreciation by the art world. And he goes on to define the art world as a complex system involving artists, artworks, the public, and institutions.
So it's like a social agreement that certain things count as art.
In a way, yes, but this view has also been criticized. For one, it seems to exclude art that's created outside of established institutions. And it still doesn't fully escape the circularity problem. Plus, it's not clear how it distinguishes art institutions from other social institutions like, say, a scientific community or a religious group.
It seems like both Danto and Dickey are trying to capture the social and historical dimensions of art, but they run into some tricky conceptual knots.
They do. And then there's another type of conventionalist definition, the historical definition.
Okay, how does that one work?
Historical definitions define art based on its relationship to previous artworks. So something is art because it continues or builds upon a recognized tradition.
So it's all about lineage and historical context.
Right. A prominent example is Levinson's intentional historical definition, which says an artwork is something intended to be regarded in the same way that we regard previous artworks.
So it's like tracing the family tree of art.
Sort of. And there are other versions that focus on the role of historical narratives in conferring art status.
Interesting. But I can see some potential problems with this approach. Like, what about art from cultures that don't share our Western art history? Would that be excluded by definition?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And then there's the question of how we define the very first artworks in a tradition. Historical definitions seem to presuppose that there was already some art to begin with. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem.
It seems like both institutional and historical definitions offer valuable insights, but they also raise some tough questions. Now let's switch gears and look at the other major category, traditional or functional definitions. These focus on the aesthetic aspects of art, right?
Exactly. These definitions try to identify some inherent quality or intended effect that sets art apart from other things. And they often appeal to our intuitive understanding of art as something beautiful, moving, or thought-provoking.
This is probably what most people think of when they hear the word art.
I think so.
Hmm.
And it's important to distinguish here between different types of aesthetic properties. Some are perceptual, like colors and shapes, while others are relational or artistic, like irony or metaphor.
So it's not just about what we see or hear, but also about how we interpret and understand the work in a broader context.
Exactly. And some definitions also include non-perceptual aesthetic properties, suggesting that even abstract concepts can have aesthetic qualities.
That's fascinating. So can you give me some examples of these aesthetic definitions?
Sure. A well-known one is Monroe Beardsley's definition. He said art is either intended to provide a marked aesthetic experience or belongs to a class of objects typically intended to do so. This marked aesthetic experience is characterized by qualities like unity, intensity, and completeness.
So it's about creating a certain kind of experience in the viewer.
Right. And then there's Nick Zangwill, who focuses on the intentional endowment of aesthetic properties. He argues that artists have an insight that certain non-aesthetic features will lead to aesthetic effects.
So it's not just about the object itself, but about the artist's intention and understanding.
Yeah, that's a key part of his view. And there are other definitions that emphasize the appropriateness of form and content, the evaluative aspect of aesthetic judgments, or the way aesthetic properties relate to underlying formal properties.
It seems like there's a whole spectrum of aesthetic definitions, each with its own emphasis and nuances. But I'm guessing these definitions also face criticism, right?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. One common criticism is that they're too narrow. They seem to exclude a lot of modern and contemporary art that deliberately avoids traditional aesthetic qualities.
Like Duchamp's ready-mades again.
Yeah, those are a constant challenge. And on the flip side, some argue that aesthetic definitions are too broad. They could potentially include beautifully designed everyday objects that we wouldn't normally call art.
So a well-crafted chair could be art.
That's the worry. And then there's the problem of bad art. If art is defined by its aesthetic qualities, how do we explain art that's just plain bad?
Right, it's like a beautiful painting with terrible composition, or a well-written poem with no emotional depth.
Exactly. And some even question the coherence of the aesthetic itself. Is it a real objective property, or is it just a subjective feeling?
So the very foundation of these definitions is shaky.
That's the argument. But defenders of aesthetic definitions have come up with responses.
Oh, like what?
Well, some argue for a broader conception of aesthetic properties that includes things like humor, irony, or even the act of creative presentation itself. They say these qualities can be found in unconventional art too.
So even Duchamp's urinal has a kind of aesthetic value.
That's the idea. And some even suggest that ready-mades are parasitic on traditional art. They only gain their meaning in relation to art that does have aesthetic qualities.
Okay, so they're like freeloaders in the art world.
Kind of, yeah. And as for the problem of over-inclusiveness, some argue that we can distinguish between the primary and secondary functions of objects. Like, a chair's primary function is to be sat on, but it can also have an aesthetic function.
So it's about intent and context.
Right. And regarding bad art, some say it still has some minimal aesthetic value, even if it's not very good. It's just further down the scale.
Okay, so it's not an all or nothing
Well,
thing.
exactly. So the debate about aesthetic definitions is complex and ongoing. And finally, we have the last category, hybrid definitions.
These are the ones that try to combine elements of both conventionalist and aesthetic approaches, right?
Precisely. They're trying to find a middle ground that can accommodate both the social and historical aspects of art and its aesthetic qualities.
A kind of best of both worlds approach.
You could say that, But these definitions also face challenges.
I bet. Like what?
Well, they can inherit the problems of both conventionalism and aestheticism if they're not carefully formulated. And they need to avoid circularity, where art is defined in terms of other art concepts without any independent grounding.
Right. It can't just be a word salad.
Exactly. So there are a few notable examples of hybrid definitions. One is Longworth and Scarantino's disjunctive definition.
Disjunctive. That sounds complicated.
It basically means it's a definition with multiple options. They say art is defined by a set of minimally sufficient conditions, meaning any one of those conditions is enough for something to be art. But there's some vagueness about which conditions are sufficient.
Okay, so it's like a choose-your-own-adventure definition.
Kind of, yeah. Then there's Stekker's historical functionalism.
What's that one about?
Well, he defines art in terms of its belonging to a central art form at a particular time and its intention to fulfill an art function.
So it's both historical and functional.
Right. But then we need to define art function, and it's not clear how to do that without circularity. And it also raises questions about non-aesthetic art.
Okay, so more complexities. What other hybrid definitions are there?
There's Davies' cladistic definition, which traces art traditions back to prehistoric origins and includes elements of aesthetic excellence, genre membership, and artistic intention. And finally, there's Lopes's buck-passing view.
Buck-passing. That's an interesting name.
Yeah, it's because he basically says defining artwork depends on defining art, and then he defines art in terms of institutions, similar to Dickey's approach. So he's kind of passing the buck to someone else to define those institutions.
Ah, I see. So even these attempts to bridge the gap between conventionalism and aestheticism have their own set of issues.
They do. And finally, the encyclopedia touches on a different kind of approach: evolutionary theories of art.
Oh, this sounds intriguing. What's the evolutionary perspective?
It's about understanding the biological and ancestral roots of our engagement with art. It asks why humans are drawn to creating and experiencing art in the first place.
So it's not so much about defining art, but about explaining its origins and function.
Right. And a prominent figure here is Ellen de Sagnac. She argues that humans have this fundamental drive to make special or artify the world around them. It's not just about creating beautiful things, it's about transforming the ordinary into something extraordinary.
So art is about highlighting and intensifying our experience of the world.
Exactly. And she links this drive to early mother-infant interactions, where mothers use exaggerated vocalizations and movements to engage their babies.
Wow, that's going way back.
Yeah, she sees these interactions as the biological seedbed for art. And she points out that infants are naturally drawn to these kinds of aesthetic or proto-aesthetic features.
So it's like we're hardwired for art.
In a way, yes. But the question is whether this making special is specific enough to define art. Some worry that it's too broad and could include almost anything humans find interesting.
So it might explain our general attraction to aesthetics, but not what distinguishes art from other forms of making special.
Right. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the definition of art.
Wow, that was quite a journey. So many different perspectives and so much debate. What are the main takeaways for our listeners, especially those with a philosophical bent?
Well, I think the encyclopedia makes a good point when it says the biggest challenge is balancing the historical and cultural aspects of art with its more universal features. Different definitions prioritize different things, and that often determines their strengths and weaknesses.
Right, there's no one-size-fits-all definition.
Exactly. And ultimately, we're left with this question. Are we even sure we're talking about the same thing when we ask, what is art? Maybe the category itself is just too diverse and fluid to be captured by a single definition.
It's a humbling thought. So to our listeners out there, we leave you with a challenge. What criteria do you find most compelling when judging whether something is art? What values and assumptions shape your own understanding?
It's a question worth pondering. And maybe, after this deep dive, you'll see familiar artworks in a new light, or be inspired to explore new forms of expression with these philosophical frameworks in mind.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration into the fascinating and ever-evolving world of art.
It's been a pleasure.